Nigeria's two biggest worker unions plan to embark on a protest next week against the cost of living after the government there ended a petrol subsidy. Prices have risen sharply, including the cost of food, transport and power. President Bola Tinubu said the move was necessary to improve the struggling economy. Prices have risen sharply, including the cost of food, transport and power. Let's get some insight on this, and we speak to Tobi Daniel Joseph, broadcast journalist there in Nigeria. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on, Tobi. How big are these?
Thank you for having me.
How big are these unions, the National Labour Congress and the Trade Union Congress?
Well, basically, these are the biggest unions that you have in Nigeria. The NLC and the TUC. You have the NLC comprising of all workers who are under the employ of the federal, state, and local governments. Then you have the TUC, which also encapsulates some of the civil servants under the public service and in the public service, and then you have some of them who are in the private sector. So these are basically the biggest unions in Nigeria, the NLC and the TUC. So their threats, as it were, cannot be waved aside.
Yeah, indeed. And has there been such a collaboration between the two labor movements before?
Absolutely. For years or for decades, when the organized labor unions intend to go on strike or decide to go on strike, they've always worked together, collaborated, engaged the government on all fronts together. And when the discussions are not favorable, they decide to go on strike together. So this is going to be a total shutdown, as promised by the labor unions, if the federal government fails to quickly re-engage them and find a middle ground before the October 3rd kickoff of the nationwide strike.
Yeah. How long have they been engaging? How long has this engagement been going on?
Well, like a week or 2 weeks after the pronouncement of President Bola Tinubu as regards the removal of subsidy. And that dates back to May 29th, 2023, the day of the inauguration. Because if you recall that in the inaugural speech, the president actually echoed the subsidy removal gone, which of course started with the past administration of former President Muhammadu Buhari. So since then, there's been that rippling effect of that fuel subsidy removal. And so since then, they've been trying to engage the organized labor and other relevant stakeholders with a view to at least find a way to mitigate the effect of the fuel subsidy removal.
Yeah. Interesting. Is there a move either way? I mean, of course, government has taken the subsidy completely off, but are the unions willing to meet government halfway? We know, for example, that this move of cutting the subsidy has been welcomed by some investors to Nigeria, but which has strengthened, I suppose, the government's view to keep them on. But is there give and take on both sides as far as the negotiation is concerned?
Absolutely. And I say not only the organized labor, talk about the NLC and the TUC, an average Nigerian understand what the issues are. And I tell you this, quite frankly, that Nigerians understand the reason for the removal. There is a consensus, as it were, that subsidy must go because it's costing Nigeria trillions of naira annually, and that's a waste. So there is a consensus that it should go. Now, the area of disagreement is the removal and the palliatives that have been rolled out, the programs and policies that could actually help cushion the effect of the removal. So I think that is what the organized labor has an issue with. Not that they don't understand why Mr. President and his administration has decided to remove it. So they are willing to meet the government halfway.
Right.
However, the issues are deeper than that. If you are going to cushion the effect of subsidy removal immediately, you first have to tackle the rising cost of transportation and the rising cost of food prices. And of course, that the rise in food prices, which of course translates to every other thing, goods and services, everything has skyrocketed. There is an inflation rate, a double-digit inflation rate of 35% in Nigeria. That is unprecedented. That is huge. You also see the price of a liter of PMS, premium motor spirit, otherwise known as petrol, also tripling. The price went from a little above 200 naira to now between 580, 590 naira and 650 naira per liter. That is a lot. So you cannot say that workers cannot grow. So what do you do in that instance? So when you want to mitigate the effects of fuel subsidy removal for an average Nigerian worker, you have to be talking about increase in minimum wage. 30,000 minimum wage definitely cannot take an average Nigerian worker anywhere right now under the current double-digit inflation rate, the current rising cost of living. You cannot expect a Nigerian worker to survive with 30,000 minimum wage. So the federal government definitely is tinkering with an increment in the minimum wage. But how far can they go? Don't forget that there are federal, state, and local government workers. As it were, local governments are fighting and battling with paying their own workers. That's a different topic entirely, with states having been accused of tampering with local government funds. There is an emasculation of the local government at that level. Some have even clamored that the federal government, that is government at the center, take up the responsibility of paying these local government employees. So the federal government can afford to say, for example, they want to pay about 100,000 naira as minimum wage. But they can't do that in isolation, because it's going to be a tripartite agreement between the government, the federal government, between the states, between the local government, and of course the private sector. How many of our private sector enterprises can afford to pay 100,000 naira to a worker? How many of the states are viable enough, financially solvent enough to actually pay that huge? So you see the dilemma that the federal government finds itself, and you see why it's also reasonable for the organized labor to also try to meet the government at a middle ground, because it's not just the federal government mouthing, oh, we'll give you so amount. It's about the workability and feasibility of that increment. The government can say, oh, we'll do this, and the federal government pays its own part, but the states fail to do so. And so the local government also will be grappling with payment of that minimum wage. That is also what you see in the private sector. So it's a very tricky situation. Constant engagement, compromise, middle grounds have to be reached before this can be done.
Now, there have been two warning strikes, at least what I see, one in August, and there was another one in September. What was the support for those strikes? Because it seems they were somewhat warning strikes to indicate to the government that there is readiness, certainly, for the complete shutdown on the 3rd of October.
Well, I just say that the warning strikes don't achieve much. The supports are not usually huge, because people don't really take the organized labor serious when it's just about warning strike. But when you declare a nationwide strike where there is a total shutdown, then the workers themselves and the people begin to take the organized labor seriously. And I think that is what the government will also take seriously. The unions have a saying that strike is the only language that government understands. And I think I agree with that. So these warning strikes that they've had have achieved nothing. And I think this nationwide strike that has been declared, that is about to be embarked upon, may actually do it for the organized labor. But of course, it's still not going to be an easy ride for both the organized labor and the government. They are still going to get to the negotiation table, reach a compromise as regards this, give and take on both sides before they can reach an amicable resolution and conclusion. But what it is that Nigerians are not smiling, even though they understand the need for this removal of subsidy, even though they are seeming to adjust to the high cost of living. People have adjusted, people like me have adjusted to buying petrol for 600 naira, 590 naira, 615 naira per liter. People have adjusted to the price of food, the hike in the price of food and other commodities. People will adjust. That is Nigerians for you, very resilient, very determined. They are hustlers by nature. But the fact remains that it is biting. It is very huge when it comes to what they can actually accommodate and contain in them. So Nigerians are not smiling, as it were. But I believe that there can't be a resolution anytime soon, even before the October 3rd. Don't be surprised, Tabu, that strike may not even go ahead if the federal government actually quickly meets with the leaders of the organized labor before October 3rd. Anything can happen. I've seen it happen many times before in Nigeria. Before the strike happens on the due date, then some meeting or levels of consultations or meetings will happen, and then they will just call it up because a resolution or a solution has been arrived at. So that is also a possibility.
Yeah. The Minister of Labour and Employment saying that, of course, the strike would aggravate the current economic challenges facing the country, but believes that the House of Representatives can certainly mediate between the federal government and Labour and fast-track some kind of agreement. What can the House of Representatives do? What are the dynamics there?
Well, I understand what the minister is trying to say, but I do not see what the House of Representatives or what the National Assembly in general are going to do as regards that. I agree with him, however, that shutting down the nation or shutting down the economy, as it were, through the strike will only aggravate the situation, not when we are biting with crude oil theft and low crude oil production in the Niger Delta region and Nigeria in general. And then we are battling double-digit inflation. Poverty index is on the rise. I understand that. So, but you have to appeal to the sensibilities of the organized labor and the Nigerian workers to quickly happen that. However, we also need to ask the state governments what they are doing with the palliative funds that have been released by the federal government to the state. Last month, in August to be precise, the federal government, under the leadership of President Bola Tinubu, actually released 5 billion naira to each of the 36 states of the Federation and the Federal Capital Territory. However, what the Minister of Finance and the Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Mr. Waledo, has said in recent time is that out of the 5 billion naira grants and loans that should go to the state to cushion the effect of the removal of subsidy and, of course, provide palliatives to Nigerian citizens, only 2 billion naira has actually been released. So what has each state governor done with his 2 billion naira? This is a very pertinent and germane question. While we have seen the likes of Governor Babagana Zulum of Borno State coming up with different palliative moves and efforts, the distribution of food, of bags of rice, of maize, of fertilizers to farmers, rollout of so many of those commodities to IDPs, to citizens of, to indigents of Borno State, or even residents, as it were. We've seen Lagos State rolling out electric buses, as it were, that are subsidized so that people can actually save when it comes to the cost of transportation. You've seen the governor of Ogun State, Prince Dakwa Abiodun, roll out compressed natural gas-powered buses to also cushion the effect of transportation. But we need to see more. We need to do more. And we have to critically engage these governors to say, hey, what are you doing? With 2 billion naira that has been released to you, 2 billion naira is about $2 million US dollars. So what have you done with this amount to at least help the common man on the street? These are questions that we need to ask, because the federal government can't begin to disburse funds into the pocket of average or individual Nigerians. Right. That, of course, will also lead to huge hike in inflation. What they can do is also channel those funds through the state, and the state channel the same funds to the local government, and of course it would eventually get to the doorstep of every Nigerian. That is how they can do it, unless they can come up with other innovative ways to actually do it. So this is the way forward. The Minister of Labour, the Minister of Finance, the state governors, in fact, the entire National Economic Council need to meet urgently to fashion out the way forward as regards this.
Tobi, Daniel, Joseph, I appreciate your time, man. Thank you very much for coming on this evening and that intervention there. That is broadcast journalist in Nigeria, Tobi, Daniel, Joseph, on the situation there. As far as that looming shutdown, 3rd of October is the day that the biggest unions there have set as a day for the shutdown.